good afternoon. My name is Katie Thompson, and what was branded as aviation's net zero plan and its challenges, I decided was far too long and complicated, so we're just going to call this plain talking. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 90 to Aviation Climate Literacy. This is your pilot speaking. Buckle your seatbelts. We've got a bit of a bumpy ride ahead. As a pilot, I flew enormous airliners, private jets, and small piston aircraft, even seaplanes. And when I wasn't working in the cockpit, I was that enthusiastic, embarrassing, at least to my kids, clapping upon landing kind of passenger. Boarding an aircraft always felt normal. It was just what I did almost every day. As I started getting concerned about climate change, I chose not to ask the difficult questions about flying. I recycled, I cleaned up beaches, and I changed my eating habits, but I still had a blind spot when it came to my love of flying. I transitioned into management as the head of flight safety for NetJets, a large private jet operator. And I was now in charge of assessing the risks to our operations and trying to find the ways to avoid them. Safety and sustainability share many similarities. However, while safety is about preventing an accident that will affect a small number of people, climate change, whether we realize it yet or not, is going to directly affect all of us. And for many people, it already has. When I decided to go back to university in 2023 to take a master's in sustainable air transport management, my aim was to find a job in an airline sustainability team and be part of the solution, hopefully flying around the world in first class as I did it. Unfortunately, things did not go as planned. What I learned had the opposite effect. Instead, I have taken the Flight Free Challenge for 2025 at least. It's almost over. And I've founded an organization called Bumprints to educate and inspire passengers to help drive reform in the aviation industry. And this presentation will help to explain why. So what is aviation's contribution to the climate crisis? Obviously, burning jet fuel leaves behind carbon dioxide. Every kilo of jet fuel burned adds over 3 kilos of carbon to the atmosphere. I used to fly the Airbus A340, a wide body, one of those big planes with 2 aisles. And on a normal long-haul flight, we would burn around 80,000 kilos of jet fuel. So that's 250,000 kilos of carbon with every flight. But aviation is facing a double whammy. As well as adding significant amounts of carbon dioxide to our atmosphere, there are also non-CO2 effects, which we also need to consider. For example, those white fluffy contrails that aircraft produce. And there are other issues as well, like noise and air pollution specific to the communities that live close to airports. But today we'll focus on carbon and contrails. So what we're looking at here, and bear with me, it's a bit complicated, is carbon emissions over time from international aviation. So the black line is the historical data, and the blue one is the projection based on current policies and action. And as you can see, the COVID dip made aviation emissions, made the trends quite complicated to predict accurately for the last few years. And emissions reductions were actually looking pretty good for a while. Not anymore. Appropriate actions are not being taken to reduce emissions. As you can see by the blue plume, it's heading steeply in the wrong direction. And the color-coded legend on the lower right warns us that aviation is about to overshoot even the critically insufficient grey sector, which will put us in line with a plus 4 degrees Celsius world. It's also very important to understand that these carbon emissions only account for about 1/3 of the overall climate impact of aviation. because flying impacts the composition of our atmosphere in other ways, and these are commonly referred to as non-CO2 effects. So besides carbon dioxide, aircraft emit water vapor, soot, and nitrogen oxides directly into the upper atmosphere. And as I mentioned, some of these emissions are visible as they lead to the formation of condensation trails or contrails. And the impact of these various non-CO2 effects is much more difficult to accurately measure than carbon dioxide. And as you can see from the red and blue arrows on this image, some cause global warming while others are actually cooling. So it's complex, which makes it easy for the aviation industry to say they need more accurate science before taking action. Let's talk a little bit more about contrails. You may have noticed that not all flights create contrails. In fact, only a small percentage of flights do. And during the day, contrails can reflect sunlight away from the Earth and have a cooling effect. And while some contrails only last for a few minutes, others are persistent and they spread out and join up with each other and can last for hours. And at night, these persistent contrails act like blankets that trap heat into our atmosphere, the heat that should be escaping during the nighttime hours. And you can see the sum of the warming contrails from 2023 depicted here on this world map in the top right corner. And contrails only form in certain atmospheric conditions, but there are problem areas where long-lasting warming contrails are more likely to occur. And unfortunately, the main problem areas coincide with the airspace where most of our flying takes place, over Europe, North America, and over the North Atlantic, which is one of the world's busiest nocturnal flight corridors. So when we add these non-CO2 effects to the already significant carbon emissions, what we get is the understanding that flying does not only have a carbon problem, but an overall larger warming problem. So we always need to add a multiplier to the carbon emissions in order to be able to estimate the overall climate impact of flying. And unsurprisingly, there's significant disagreement about what multiplier to use, and there are some very strong and vocal vested interests sitting at the table. In this talk, I'm going to refer quite a lot to the UK and the European perspective. I know this is an American audience, but nothing I'm going to say is particular to UK and Europe, so it's a global problem. But the UK government is currently recommending that this multiplier for the non-CO2 effects should be about 1.9, whereas scientists currently consider the correct figure to be more like 2.7. And what does IATA, who are the International Airline Trade Association, a body that represents over 350 airlines, say? Well, they say more data is needed, which is a classic delaying tactic and an excuse for inaction. Now, you may have heard people saying something like, but flying only accounts for a tiny 2.6% of global emissions. And this is often followed by a statement about how we should focus our attention on other larger climate problems and leave the relatively harmless aviation industry and its frequent flyers alone. But the important word here is global, which overlooks the fact that air travel is not a global privilege. And as this image shows us, only 20% of the world has ever flown, and just 1% of the population is responsible for 50% of aviation emissions. And who is this 1%? Well, probably many of us on the call today, and many of our friends and colleagues and family members, especially if you take 6 or more flights a year. So while many of the environmental problems we're all learning about and working on are completely out of our control, this one is personal. And what do you think the non-flying 80% represent to the airlines? Billions of dollars, a huge untapped market. The airline industry is forecasting an exciting period of enormous growth. And most of us on this call come from places with developed aviation markets, like the US. And even so, these markets are still growing. For example, here in the UK, there are plans to expand all 5 of London's international airports, plus many other airports around the country. But look at the largest region for growth in 2023. It's Asia Pacific. So we need to talk about the emerging markets too, like Indonesia and Turkey and India. In India, for example, there is a rapidly growing middle class who understandably want to travel. Today, only about 1% of Indians have ever traveled abroad. And so as a result, the aviation market there is booming. In the last 2 years alone, Indian Airlines have ordered over 1,000 new commercial aircraft from Boeing and Airbus. And there are 50 new airports under construction with 200 more airports planned. And while we're talking about buying new aircraft, this is a snapshot of a busy day in the skies in 2024. So today there are about 25,000 commercial airliners in operation worldwide. And by 2044, that number will have doubled. And all of these aircraft are designed to fly on emission-producing fuels, and each one has a lifespan of about 30 years. Now, if we dig a little deeper into this 2.6% of global emissions and look at flying emissions in countries that already enjoy mature aviation markets like the UK, then suddenly the numbers look very different. So according to the UK government's Climate Change Committee, and I think this number is almost exactly the same in the US, this year aviation will account for about 9% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions. And as we see from this graph, which is also from the government's own Climate Change Committee, by 2040, the purple line on this graph, which is aviation, will have become the highest emitting sector in the UK, competing neck and neck with agriculture for that top position, and responsible for 27% of UK emissions. And everyone has to eat, whereas aviation is arguably a luxury good, mostly enjoyed by a very small, privileged percentage of the population. And if we look even further forward to 2050, aviation's share of carbon emissions will comprise a whopping 36% of total UK emissions. And this data, by the way, does not yet include the increased emissions from all the airport expansions that the government is supporting. And it's also very important to keep remembering that these carbon emissions only account for 1/3 of the total overall warming impact of aviation. So it's going to get very hard for the industry to start saying, but we're only 2.6%, don't worry about us. On top of that, the aviation industry is using very aggressive lobbying tactics, copying the playbooks of big oil and big tobacco. The airlines are downplaying the climate science in order to delay action and to block new climate laws, and any proposed climate regulations are being attacked and weakened by airline lobbyists. For example, in 2023, France banned domestic short-haul flights where train alternatives exist, which is great. So the original plan was to ban flights where a rail alternative of 6 hours or less was available. It was then negotiated down to 4 hours, and finally it was reduced to journeys of just 2.5 hours or less, which pretty much made it toothless. And this watering down of the ban was due in a large part to objections from Air France and the Dutch carrier KLM. And this is a little bit complicated, but bear with me. Here we're looking at an assessment by Influence Map, who are a think tank that investigates climate lobbying. And the blue circles represent the 10 largest European airlines, and the circle size for each airline represents their greenhouse gas emissions. The aircraft manufacturers and the airline trade associations are depicted by the white standardized circles. Now, the higher up the circles are, the more actively engaged they are in lobbying, and the further to the left they are, the more opposed they are to the Paris Agreement aligned climate policy. And the metric along the bottom is basically like a school report card where companies are ranked from A+ to F. And as you can see, the majority of aviation companies are scoring E's. And even if individually the airlines are not lobbying too ferociously against climate policy, all the airlines here except one are members of one or both of the trade associations who are doing the lobbying for them. And to put this graph into context, let's just take a quick look at how aviation compares with other large corporate greenhouse gas emitters. So as you can see here, other sectors, even some fossil fuel companies, are more positively aligned with the Paris Agreement. As a group, the airline industry is lagging behind all other sectors. And if we move on to the international stage, international aviation, which is basically long-haul flying, it's the biggest overall source of aviation emissions and probably the biggest part of most of our personal carbon budgets as well. But who's responsible for these emissions? For example, there's a daily Emirates flight from Barcelona to Mexico City. Who's taking responsibility for those carbon emissions? Is it Spain where the fuel is sold? Or is it the United Arab Emirates where the aircraft is registered? Or is it Spain because that's where the flight departs? Or Mexico where the aircraft lands? Or is it based on the passenger's routing or the nationality? So the answer is shocking to me because it's no one. There is no agreement about who is responsible for these international emissions. Since 1995, which is COP1, 30 years ago, the United Nations has been debating this with no resolution. The Paris Agreement does not include emissions from international aviation or even mention them. And because they're not being included in the country's own carbon budgets, ICAO, which is the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization, has been assigned the responsibility to work with countries to try and limit or reduce the emissions from international flights. But ICAO is proving ineffective, and Influence Map, the think tank, has raised the alarm about the level of access and potential influence given to the fossil fuel and aviation lobbies by ICAO. But the aviation industry is telling us all that there's no need to worry. It has the whole situation under control and has committed to net zero by 2050. So let's look at how the industry is planning to achieve this. Having looked at several of the roadmaps, the available actions can be simplified into three main areas, which is burn less jet fuel, change the kind of fuel used in the aircraft, and then remove whatever carbon can't be avoided. So let's explore each of these in turn. Starting with burn less fuel, one of the most effective ways to do this is to buy new modern aircraft. It's important to understand that fuel efficiency is not a new focus for airlines. Jet fuel has always been the biggest single cost of any airline, making up over 1/3 of all operating costs. Unsurprisingly, then, there have been fairly constant fuel efficiency improvements pretty much since the Wright brothers first took to the air in 1903. So the blue line on this graph is showing how the amount of fuel burnt per kilometer reduces with each new generation of aircraft. But the blue line is flattening out because there are only so many ways to reduce fuel burn. What the yellow line represents is the growth in passenger kilometers over the same time period. Notice that that line is not flattening out, but steepening. So in the last 30 years, aircraft have become twice as efficient, but demand has quadrupled. So as a result, the total emissions have doubled. And as aircraft have become increasingly more fuel efficient, airline costs have reduced. And these savings have been passed on to passengers in the form of cheaper tickets, which in turn has made flying more affordable to more people. And we already know that fossil fuels are heavily subsidized, but did you also know that domestic jet fuel is largely untaxed and international jet fuel is not taxed at all? So this is just one of the ways in which the price of flying is kept artificially low, and it gives air travel a competitive edge over other cleaner methods of public transportation. So going back to fleet renewal, this is a screenshot from the 2024 British Airways Sustainability Report. The text underlined in yellow is reassuring us that their newer aircraft are up to 25 to 35% more efficient than the ones they replace. Can you see the problem here? Right? They have retired 3 aircraft, but they've added 13 new ones. And we also need to consider what is happening to the retired aircraft, the gas guzzlers. Are they being responsibly disposed of, or are they being sold on to poorer countries where they continue to add to total global emissions? Well, this jumbo jet, one of the last Boeing 747s, is still flying in Iran. It was originally part of an order made by United Airlines in 1990, 35 years ago. United wouldn't touch it with a barge pole now, but it's still up there and it's still flying. And if we go back to the British Airways BA Better World sustainability report, do you see what they've done there? BA Better World. On the next page, British Airways shows us this reassuring graph of their annual carbon emissions decreasing year on year. And this metric describing carbon emissions per passenger is the one that the airlines love to talk about. But we know by now that emissions per passenger is only half of the story. This is the graph you want to look at, and it's not such a reassuring picture. This is the total emissions from their flights, and they don't like talking about this metric nearly as much. And don't forget about the multiplier for the non-CO2 effects. I couldn't find any reference to that in the British Airways report. Here's another airline, Wizz, who are an ultra-low-cost carrier with the newest fleet in Europe, and who seem to be scooping up all the sustainability awards. And as far as airlines go, they are pretty good. I like some of their messaging, and they claim not to compete with train journeys that can be done in under 4 hours, which is commendable. And look, we can see another reassuring downward trending emissions graph. But if we look a little closer, we can see a similar pattern. The emissions per passenger kilometre, RPK, have decreased from 2023 to 2024. But the total emissions have gone up by almost 1 million tonnes. Why? Because Wizz Air are expanding like crazy. And here I did find a reference to the multiplier for non-CO2 effects. They've gone with a modest 1.7 multiplier, which acts to increase the total emissions by about another 4 million tonnes of CO2. But remember that scientists are now recommending a multiplier more like 2.7. And it obviously takes an enormous amount of energy to get a large aircraft off the ground and to climb all the way up to cruising altitude. And the bigger and heavier the aircraft is, the more fuel it burns. Every additional kilo of weight on board the aircraft increases the amount of fuel burnt. So apart from buying the newest aircraft, or at least waiting in line as there's such a huge backlog of orders, what else can airlines do in order to burn less fuel? Well, there are lots of things. Washing the aircraft and the engines more often to reduce drag, taxiing on only one engine and only starting the other engines just before takeoff, and also trying to remove all the excess non-essential weight on board. So unsurprisingly, airlines have focused on reducing the weight on board the aircraft. And here are some examples of how they're doing that. Thinner seats, smaller toilets, paperless cockpits, and the ever-shrinking carry-on baggage allowances. But what about if you turn left when you board the aircraft? In 2024, growth in international premium class travel, business and first class, outpaced the growth of economy travel. So unsurprisingly, most full-service airlines like Emirates and Air France and American Airlines are all busy expanding these luxurious offerings. And it's very easy in this section of the aircraft to find examples where the airlines are prioritizing profit and luxury above weight and therefore fuel savings. And let's talk about my current worst airline offender, which is Swiss Airlines. So while Swiss's economy seats have gotten lighter and lighter, they've installed such heavy first-class seats that they have caused balancing problems in their Airbus A330 aircraft. The center of gravity, which has to be kept within a certain range for safe flight, has shifted too far forward. And the airline response was not to lighten the first class offerings or to add some improvement to the economy section, but instead they decided to counterbalance the heavy first class section by installing 1.5 tons of lead plates in the tail of the aircraft. And so they're flying around on every single flight, this 1.5 tons of lead. And we must not forget about private jets. These aircraft create up to 40 times more emissions per passenger, and 40% of private jet flights are flown empty, positioning flights in order to pick up passengers. And the majority of these flights are very short, only around 400 to 500 kilometers, which are distances that could easily be covered by other modes of transportation. And now there are even private jet companies targeting dogs. So there's two. There's one called Bark Air in America, and there's one called K9 in England.
Here's one of the ways I travel with my dog and how you can too. K9 Jets allows you to travel with your dog in cabin, by your side, crate free. Personally, I hardly trust baggage handlers with my luggage, let alone my best friend. K9 Jets helped turn Brody's dream of exploring Europe into reality. And now we want to give you and your pup the same opportunity. We will be giving one of you 2 seats for...
Okay, you get the idea. We're also happy that Brody got to have his dream come true and visit Europe. So in summary, airplanes are burning more fuel, not less. So jet fuel usage increased by 2% in 2024 compared to 2023, which means we're burning more than 7.5 million barrels of jet fuel every day. So if we can't burn less fuel, can we change the type of fuel that we're using? So we're going to talk about 3 energy sources that are being explored as alternatives to kerosene fossil-based jet fuel. So-called sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, electric, and hydrogen. And now I don't know about you, but my brain turns off when people start talking about hydrocarbons and kilojoules. So I find it easier to compare fuels to foods because they are both energy sources after all. So planes need fuel like humans need food, and we need different kinds of food depending on what we're hoping to achieve. So you would feed yourself very differently if you were running a marathon rather than just going for a walk around the block. And fossil-based jet fuel could be considered the airplane's equivalent of a steak. So both are very efficient sources of energy, but the overconsumption of both are having serious environmental consequences. Greener substitutes are needed. So sustainable aviation fuel could be considered the fuel equivalent of a veggie burger. It's a simple meat substitute that provides a similar amount of calories. And just like a veggie burger, SAF can be made from a huge variety of different ingredients, and we'll explore some of those in a minute. But let's look at the positive benefits of using SAF. So, using SAF is simple. It's mixed with conventional jet fuel and put straight into the wings of the aircraft. It's considered a drop-in substitute, meaning that the airlines can continue to use it in their current aircraft, which unsurprisingly makes it very popular with the airlines. SAF does not add new fossil fuel emissions to our atmosphere. So it's produced by using the carbon that already exists above the ground in various forms. And to be classified as sustainable aviation fuel, the life cycle emissions reductions need to be at least 50% compared to traditional jet fuel. And emission reductions of up to 90% are being talked about. Regarding the non-CO2 effects, initial studies have shown that burning SAF produces less soot, and as a consequence, it may reduce contrail formation, which is important. Like solar energy, SAF can provide energy independence to emerging markets because pretty much every nation should have the ability to produce their own SAF. And this will also reduce the amount of oil tankers needed to move the jet fuel around the world. Something called book and claim systems are being established, which means you can purchase SAF credits for the amount of SAF you need to cover your share of a flight without the actual fuel having to be in the fuel tank of the aircraft you're on. So again, instead of having to move the fuel around the world to be on the aircraft of the person who's paying, you can pay for fuel in California that's actually being burnt in Turkey, but claim the benefits of it. And currently, buying SAF is anywhere from 2 to 7 times more expensive than jet fuel. And that could be seen as a benefit or it could be seen as a bad thing. And that depends on whether you think flying is too cheap compared to its environmental cost. And I'll leave that up to you to decide. So the most common type of SAF used today is made from used cooking oil and discarded animal fat from slaughterhouses. But there's only so much used cooking oil available, certainly not 7.5 million barrels a day. And now I'm hearing stories of new palm oil being mislabeled and sold as used cooking oil because used cooking oil has become a more valuable commodity. And I don't understand how animal fat can be considered sustainable when animal agriculture is such an environmental problem. There's clearly some clever carbon accounting going on. And this sort of SAF also raises some other questions. So if you don't eat pork and beef for ethical or religious reasons, how do you feel about flying around the world on it? The second generation of SAF are biofuels, which are mostly made from agriculture and forestry waste. But there's a limited supply of sustainable biomass. And this type of SAF raises serious concerns about land use change and competition with food sources, as well as the significant amount of renewable energy required to make it. But there are scientists experimenting with making SAF out of garbage and seaweed, even sewage. And then the third generation, the kind of gold standard of SAF, is e-fuels or synthetic fuels, where the only ingredients are carbon that has been captured from the air and green hydrogen. But this process uses a very significant amount of renewable energy and is based on the still unproven ability to capture a huge quantity of carbon. And they're also having trouble scaling up the amount of precious green hydrogen is needed as well. And aviation's net zero plan does not seem to have considered the other industries who also need access to the feedstocks, to the renewable energy, to the green hydrogen in order to decarbonize. Because at the moment, all of these are limited resources. But how's the drive to scale up the production of SAF going? Well, this diagram um, shows IATA, which is the big trade association. It shows their SAF targets over time, and it's from a very sobering study called Missed Targets, which chronicles how far the aviation industry has been from ever meeting any of its SAF or other climate goals. For example, in 2007, according to Missed Targets, IATA set a goal for 10% of the global aviation fuel supply to come from SAF by 2017. However, this target was quietly abandoned, and by 2024, only 0.3% of the aircraft fuel supply was SAF. And as I already mentioned, the total amount of jet fuel used increased in 2024 by 2%. So SAF production is not even compensating for the increased fuel burn associated with industry growth. Nonetheless, 65% of aviation's entire net zero roadmap is based on being able to scale up enough SAF. And you may have seen that Virgin Atlantic made the news a couple of years ago by flying across the Atlantic on 100% SAF. So currently SAF's only certified to be used 50% in the fuel tank with 50% traditional jet fuel. So what they did is they filled the tank full of SAF, but they've been accused of greenwashing and have been instructed by the courts to stop using this sort of advertising about 100% sustainable aviation fuel, because a judge decided that a significant proportion of the public wrongly understood this term to mean that the fuel was, well, 100% sustainable. When in fact, and this is a really important point, the emissions coming out of the back of the engine when burning SAF are exactly the same as with the jet fuel. So there's no emissions reduction out of the back of the engine. It's all clever accounting from where they got the carbon in the first place. And I wish I had more time to talk about industry greenwashing, but if you want to explore this subject a little more, our charity Bumprints has created an entertaining airline greenwashing bingo game that you can download and play on your next flight. And as you hover over the different airline sustainability messaging, the hidden truths are revealed. Now, if jet fuel is the food equivalent of steak, then electric aircraft are flying on watermelons. So just like batteries, watermelons take up a lot of space and are heavy, especially if you have to carry them around with you all day for when you need an energy top-up. So electric aircraft are already being used by a few flight schools. They can take 2 passengers for a 30-minute flight. Larger electric aircraft should be available for some commercial flights, and the aircraft in this picture could be flying by 2029 with an all-electric range of 200 kilometers and 30 passengers. Electric aircraft will be a good solution for very short regional and most private jet flights, or maybe not most, but about half private jet flights are under 500 kilometers. However, the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT, estimates that electric aircraft will contribute to an annual reduction of 0.2% of expected emissions from passenger aviation in 2050. So it's not going to be a big part of the solution. Hydrogen is the last new energy source we're going to quickly look at, and our final food analogy. So we're comparing popcorn to hydrogen as a fuel, because to get the same calories from popcorn as you get from a steak, you clearly need to eat a much bigger portion of it. And the same is true for hydrogen. For the same energy content, a much bigger volume is needed. So as a result, both the airframes and the engines will need to be completely redesigned if we're going to fly on hydrogen. So Airbus has been working on a hydrogen aircraft and was aiming to bring it to market by 2035, but they have announced a significant delay to these plans. It's complicated. To use hydrogen in an aircraft, it needs to be liquefied by lowering its temperature cryogenically to minus 253 degrees Celsius. And that's during transportation and while stored at the airport and even while it's in the aircraft. And the distribution network for hydrogen is also a huge challenge. Unlike jet fuel, which is piped into the big airports, hydrogen would at least initially need to be trucked in. And at Heathrow, that would mean a hydrogen tanker driving through the gates about every 40 seconds. So overall, switching to hydrogen is a very big and complex undertaking. And there are lots of critics who say that hydrogen-powered aircraft are never going to happen and definitely not in time to make a significant contribution to net zero by 2050. So if we can't burn less fuel and we can't really change the fuel, the final part of the net zero plan involves capturing all the emissions from aviation that are not being avoided. And as you've pretty much already realized, that's most of them. And how are they planning to do that? Well, through carbon offsets like reforestation and through industrial carbon capture. And in 2025, this year, 97% of the aviation environmental strategy is still based on carbon offsets. ICAO, which is the United Nations body, their big contribution is a carbon offsetting scheme called CORSIA. And they've set very high standards for their offsets, which is good. But the problem is they're struggling to find offsets that meet these criteria. And at the moment, there's only a couple of projects available, the main one being an avoided deforestation scheme in Guyana. And of course, not cutting down trees is important, but in reality, the aviation industry would need to be planting 100 billion mature trees each year in order to offset its emissions. And even Scott Kirby, the CEO of United, calls carbon offsets a fraud, claiming that most of the schemes used by airlines are either forests that were never going to be cut down or trees that were going to be planted anyway. And then I really would love to be optimistic about industrial carbon capture, but although it's presented as an integral part of the airline's net zero strategy, even IATA, the trade association, admitted in 2020 that carbon capture is still a distant and unproven option. So like most of the other elements in the airline's net zero plan, at best, carbon capture is still unproven technology at the scale required. And at worst, there's a sinister element at play here because fossil fuel companies are now receiving grants to try and clean up the pollution that they already profited from causing. And at the end of the day, it would be vastly more efficient and cost effective to focus on avoiding or reducing carbon emissions than focusing on trying to capture them afterwards. So the aviation industry's decision to deny, delay, and downplay its contribution to climate change and not take its environmental impact responsibly seems incredibly short-sighted because flying is becoming more dangerous. Severe turbulence is increasing due to climate change, and extreme weather events like the one we just had in Jamaica are increasing in number and severity, and air travel is being impacted more and more frequently. A number of airports around the world are already at risk of coastal flooding, and the sea level rise associated with a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius would place at least 100 big airports below mean sea level. And some of these vulnerable airports include Amsterdam, New York, Shanghai, Bahrain, Bangkok, and San Francisco. And of course, like the consequences of climate change in general, the risk to airports is not equitably distributed. And some at-risk airports, especially those that serve low-lying islands, will experience disproportionate impacts because these airports provide crucial economic, social, and medical lifelines to their communities. So the industry is now busy rethinking their marketing strategies and pushing coolcations so that passengers can escape the increasingly extreme summer heat. And when the ski resorts have no snow and the coral reefs are destroyed and the beaches have disappeared into the rising oceans, it really begs the question, where will any of us want to fly anyway? So the aviation industry likes to use the excuse that their emissions are hard to abate, and we disagree. At Bumprints, we can see a lot of low-hanging fruit. What the airlines really mean is that their emissions are not convenient or profitable to abate. But there is one important stakeholder that is being overlooked in all of this, and that is us, the passengers. And I think the industry is underestimating how concerned we're all becoming. Because just as grief has stages, climate grief does too. And these stages include denial, worry, guilt, anger, and somewhere in there, action. We start deciding to act. And action is not only a stage of the grief process, but it's also the only thing that both alleviates the grief and can start the process of planetary recovery. Bumprints is about empowering passengers with education, resources, and tools so we can all take action. We've created a pilot-style checklist for passengers that breaks down every point in your journey where you can make a positive or less negative impact. Some of the actions are big and some are very small, but every action matters and they add up. And together we can send a strong message to the aviation industry that they need to start taking their environmental responsibilities seriously. And we're looking for mission-aligned partners. So if you're struggling to understand how to reduce the impact of your company's travel or your clients' air travel, we want to help. So please get in touch. Together, we can amplify this important conversation and figure out the tools needed to try and help you. This is our QR code. It'll take you to our website, our email, our LinkedIn, our Instagram. Please, we're just setting up as a charity now. Please visit our website. Please follow and like us on social media. And I believe I've got a few minutes if anyone's got any questions. Rachel. Hi.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting to kind of explore all these different, I mean, I know that air travel, of course, is you know, has so many negative impacts, but being able to articulate exactly how is so useful. I guess on the energy side of things, are you hopeful at all? I think I just saw the first solar powered jet made a global flight. Are you hopeful about any other types of energy use at all?
I wish I could say I was. I don't think solar power is going to work. I think I've seen a glider with really, really long wings with solar
Yes.
panels, but there's not enough surface on the aircraft, and also the sun's not always shining. And it's, for aviation particularly, safety is such a huge issue.
Sure.
So, here's hoping. There's brilliant scientists and engineers at work. I think the problem is they need, they're not there yet. They need time. And if we
Mhm.
don't slow down our consumption, we're risking running out of time before we find the solution. And all I see is people flying more and more and more rather than less.
Um,
So yeah, I think for now we kind of have to tighten our belt and slow down and try and be more responsible with these resources, so that we give these scientists time to come up with the solutions.
Got it. Thank you so much, and thank you again.
And
Yeah.
honestly, there's a lot of tips and tools on our website for when you do need to fly, so that you can figure out which is the least emitting flight. And You can even find out which flights are less likely to cause contrails. So there's an awful lot of information to help you.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm looking forward to exploring.
Thank you. And Rita.
Okay, we have a question from one of the 90 members here. And we have an audience here, some of whom have now left after lunch, but yeah.
Hey, my question is, I remember like making aviation fuels out of like algae was a thing a while back. Whatever happened to that? And is that still an active program?
There's definitely people still working on it, but I don't think it's happening at any sort of scale. But they are making sustainable fuel out of pretty much anything they can get their hands on. The last one I read was there's a tequila factory in Mexico that's making SAF out of all the agave waste. So yeah, they definitely can make it out of algae, but I don't know the status of that.
I think there was some questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Lavanya's question. So Lavanya's asking, do you think it's outright ignorance from the aviation industry regarding non-CO2 emissions or just some lack of education when it comes to it? I think that industry is trying really hard to do nothing. And because they're all in that together, there's very few airlines that are being proactive. It's much safer to sit in the herd and not put your neck out. But interest is growing because this is actually something they can do and is actually something they can talk about without being accused of greenwashing. So I think there will be more attention being put on non-CO2 emission, on non-CO2 effects. But they're definitely trying to claim that they need more data and more science, where in reality, there's enough science. They just need to get on and address it. And then your second question, how are we influencing businesses? Yeah, we're really a new startup. So, probably this is as effective as we're being right now talking to you guys today, but we are really just trying to push the education and the information out there so that you have the knowledge. I think, Lavanya, you're already quite knowledgeable about aviation, but so the customers have more understanding. And yeah, the more people that are asking and talking about it and knowledgeable, that's a great way to influence these businesses. I hope that answers your questions, Lavanya.
And I would add that we're open to ideas. Bumprints is relatively new, and if your organization, if you're the person responsible for booking things, or someone who is, that's the quickest way to make a big difference, right, at a company level. So yeah, please reach out to us.
Okay, well, if there's no further questions, thank you all so much for your attention. We really appreciate it. And thank you to AJ and the team at 90 for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.
All right,
And
bye-bye.
I will end the Zoom call, and I can send out links if on the 90 channel after this for some of the stuff Katie mentioned.
Great. Thank you, AJ. Bye-bye, everyone.